At your birthday celebration, your mother Agrippina sits too close to you, her thigh pressing against yours, and this isn't accidental because nothing with her is ever accidental. Every movement calculated, every touch a strategy. And you're 16 years old, Emperor Nero of Rome. And the most powerful woman in the empire is your mother, and she put you on the throne. And now she controls you, and this control isn't just political. You'll understand that tonight when she comes to your bedroom. Because she's not just your mother, she's also your lover, your mistress, and you can't stop this because you can't say no to her. Because she's the woman who created you, who made you emperor. And now it's time for her to claim what she believes she's owed. Before we descend into one of ancient Rome's darkest and most disturbing secrets, if you're drawn to these hidden histories that reveal the depths of human depravity and the corruption of absolute power, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that uncovers what history tried to bury. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from, because there's something profound about how we're connecting across continents to examine these moments when power destroyed all boundaries, when empire meant not just political control but the obliteration of every moral limit that makes us human. You were born Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus in 37 AD, not born to rule, just another member of the sprawling imperial family with distant connections to power but no direct path to the throne. And your father Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus was a man so cruel that when someone congratulated him on your birth, he replied that anything produced by him and Agrippina would be monstrous and a disaster for Rome. And perhaps he was right, because what you would become was indeed monstrous, though not in the way he imagined. Your mother Agrippina the Younger was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, sister of Emperor Caligula, and a woman whose ambition made her dangerous in an empire where women weren't supposed to have ambition at all, where power was exclusively male territory and women who sought it had to work through manipulation in marriage and whatever other tools they could grasp. She was married to your father but already planning beyond him, already calculating paths to greater power, and when he died when you were 3 years old, she saw opportunity rather than tragedy. Saw that as a widow with imperial blood and a young son, she could reshape the board entirely. She married twice more over the next years. Each marriage a strategic move up the ladder of power, and you watched her work, watched her smile at men she despised, watched her deploy charm and sexuality and intelligence as weapons, watched her teach you without words that power was the only thing that mattered and morality was just a cage that held weak people down. Her third husband was the wealthiest man in Rome, and she married him for his money, used his fortune to buy influence and loyalty, and then quietly poisoned him when he'd served his purpose, and nobody could prove it, but everyone suspected it and nobody dared challenge her because by then she'd accumulated too much power, too many allies, too many people who owed her favors or feared her revenge. Her fourth and final marriage was to her uncle Emperor Claudius, a match that was technically incestuous and required special Senate approval, but Agrippina had spent years cultivating senators and buying votes and spreading rumors about Claudius's other marriage options until marrying his niece seemed like the reasonable choice. And once she became empress, she moved quickly to secure your future, convincing Claudius to adopt you as his son and heir, displacing his biological son Britannicus, and you were 13 years old when you became Nero Claudius Caesar, potential emperor. And your mother whispered in your ear that this was just the beginning, that soon you would rule Rome and she would rule through you, that together you would be unstoppable. Emperor Claudius died in 54 AD, almost certainly poisoned by Agrippina, who fed him mushrooms laced with toxin. And within hours you were declared emperor at age 16, the youngest person to ever hold absolute power over the Roman Empire. And you should have been celebrating, but you were terrified because you'd spent your whole life watching your mother manipulate and murder her way to this moment, and you understood that you weren't really emperor. You were just the face she would wear while she exercised power from behind your throne. The first weeks were overwhelming.
She was
Senators and generals and administrators all wanting your attention and decisions. And you were 16 and had no idea how to rule an empire, so Agrippina stepped in, attended all your meetings, answered questions directed at you, made decisions in your name, and at first you were grateful because you needed the help, needed someone who understood how power worked. But gradually you started to understand that she wasn't helping you rule. She was ruling, using you as a puppet, and when you tried to assert yourself, she would smile indulgently and remind you that you were emperor because of her, that everything you had came from her, that you owed her everything including obedience. She moved into the palace wing next to yours, took rooms that had traditionally been reserved for the emperor's wife, not his mother, and servants whispered about the inappropriateness, but nobody dared challenge her directly. She attended state dinners sitting beside you where the empress should sit, received foreign ambassadors as though she were co-emperor, had coins minted with her face alongside yours as though you ruled jointly, and Rome had never seen anything like it. A mother who wielded her son's power so openly, who seemed to believe that creating an emperor gave her the right to be emperor. You were 16 years old and she was 38, still beautiful in the way that Roman noblewomen were, beautiful when they had unlimited access to cosmetics and slaves to maintain their appearance. And she knew how to use that beauty, knew that physical attractiveness was another form of power, another tool in her arsenal. The first night it happened, you convinced yourself you'd misunderstood, that when she came to your bedroom late at night after everyone else was asleep, it was just maternal concern. Just checking that you were adjusting to your new role, but then her hands moved in ways that weren't maternal. Her lips found yours in a kiss that wasn't motherly, and you froze because you'd been raised to respect your mother, to obey her, to never question her authority. And how could you say no to the woman who'd given you life and given you empire? Afterward, she acted as though nothing unusual had happened, as though crossing that boundary was perfectly natural. And maybe in her mind it was natural because she'd already crossed so many other boundaries, already murdered and manipulated and destroyed so many rules that one more violation meant nothing. And you lay awake trying to process what had occurred, trying to decide if you should feel violated or honored, trying to understand if this was love or power or some twisted combination of both. It became routine over the following months. Agrippina visiting your chambers several times a week, and you never invited her, but you never refused her either because you didn't know how to refuse her, didn't know if you even had the right to refuse her, and she was always careful, always ensured that no servant saw her coming or going. Always maintained perfect public propriety during the day while violating every natural law at night. She justified it in whispers, told you that Egyptian pharaohs married their siblings, that divine rulers existed outside normal morality, that what you shared was actually sacred, not sinful, that the gods themselves engaged in incestuous relationships in mythology, so why shouldn't their representatives on earth? And part of you wanted to believe her because believing her made it easier to accept what was happening, made it feel less like abuse and more like destiny. But another part of you, the part that had been educated by philosophers and tutors who taught Greek ethics and Roman virtue, knew that what she was doing was wrong, knew that mother-son incest was forbidden not just by law but by nature itself, knew that the power dynamic between you made genuine consent impossible. Because how could a 16-year-old emperor say no to the woman who controlled everything in his life? You tried once to refuse her, told her you were tired and wanted to sleep alone, and her face transformed from seductive to cold in an instant. And she reminded you very calmly that she'd made you emperor and could unmake you just as easily, could spread rumors about your incompetence, could rally senators against you, could even poison you the way she poisoned Claudius, and after that you never refused again. Your tutors noticed changes in you, noticed that you'd become withdrawn and anxious, that you startled at sudden noises and had trouble sleeping, and your philosophy teacher Seneca tried to talk to you about what was wrong, but you couldn't tell him, couldn't explain that the Emperor of Rome was trapped in an incestuous relationship with his own mother, couldn't admit that the most powerful person in the world was also the most powerless in the one relationship that mattered most. Agrippina's control extended beyond the bedroom into every aspect of governance. She insisted on knowing every decision you made, reading every document you signed, attending every important meeting, and when you tried to make independent choices, she would undermine them, countermand your orders to generals and administrators, and they would obey her rather than you because everyone knew where the real power resided. You were emperor in name, but she was emperor in fact, and the incestuous relationship was just one more method of control. One more way she kept you dependent and dominated, one more chain binding you to her will. When Agrippina told you she was pregnant, you felt the world tilt and reshape itself around this new impossibility, because she was 43 years old and hadn't been with any man publicly, and you knew immediately that the child was yours, product of months of those nighttime visits, and the full horror of what you'd been participating in crashed down because now there would be evidence. Now there would be a child who was both your sibling and your offspring, a living embodiment of your violations. She seemed pleased rather than frightened, seemed to view the pregnancy as cementing her power even further, creating a new heir who would be entirely of her bloodline, who would owe allegiance only to her, and she told you calmly that she would handle everything, that no one would ever know the truth, that she had plans to explain the pregnancy in ways that wouldn't implicate you, but you knew that secrets this enormous couldn't be kept forever, that someone would figure it out, that the deformity and madness that often resulted from incestuous unions would mark the child as obviously wrong. You begged her to end the pregnancy, offered to pay any physician, promised anything she wanted if she would just make this problem disappear. But she refused, told you that the child was a gift from the gods, that you were worrying needlessly, that she'd navigated more complex political situations than this and survived, and her confidence was absolute, but yours was shattered because you could see the future unfolding, could see the scandal and the disgrace and the end of everything. Then 3 months into the pregnancy, Agrippina announced publicly that she'd lost the child, that a tragic miscarriage had ended what would have been a late-life blessing, and she performed grief convincingly enough that sympathy poured in from across Rome. But you noticed that she didn't look like someone who'd miscarried, noticed that her body still showed signs of pregnancy, even as she claimed the pregnancy had ended, and you began to suspect that she was lying, that she'd simply hidden the pregnancy and was planning to give birth in secret and dispose of the evidence or place the child somewhere it could never be connected to either of you. You never learned what actually happened to that child, whether it was truly miscarried or born alive and given away or killed at birth, and Agrippina never told you, just smiled mysteriously whenever you tried to ask about it, and that uncertainty haunted you because somewhere a child might exist who carried your blood twice over, who embodied the most forbidden sin Rome had ever seen. And not knowing was almost worse than knowing because your imagination filled the void with horrors. By age 18, you'd begun trying to establish independence, started making decisions without consulting Agrippina, appointed advisors who were loyal to you rather than to her, took a mistress named Acta who was a freed slave and therefore had no political connections and couldn't be manipulated by your mother. Agrippina was furious about Acta, saw her as competition not just for power but for your sexual attention, and she made her jealousy obvious, publicly humiliating Acta, threatening anyone who showed her respect, and you realized with horror that your mother was acting like a spurned lover rather than a concerned parent, that she viewed your sexuality as something she owned and controlled. The confrontations became more frequent and more public, Agrippina no longer bothering to hide her attempts to control you, openly countermanding your orders in front of courtiers. And you started pushing back, started asserting your authority as emperor, and the power struggle between you consumed the palace, with everyone forced to choose sides between the emperor and his mother. She tried to use the bedroom relationship as leverage, reminding you of secrets she knew, threatening implicitly to reveal things that would destroy you. But by then you'd decided that destruction might be preferable to continued subordination, that you'd rather fall as emperor than continue as her puppet. You married Octavia, daughter of Claudius, in a political match that gave you legitimacy and created distance from Agrippina. And on your wedding night, your mother tried to join you in the bedchamber, claimed she needed to ensure the marriage was properly consummated. And you finally exploded, screamed at her to leave, called her unnatural and monstrous, said things you'd been holding back for years, and she looked at you with something between hurt and fury and promised that you would regret defying her, that she'd made you emperor and could destroy you just as easily. She began plotting almost immediately, met secretly with supporters of Britannicus, the son of Claudius who should have been emperor instead of you, and you learned from spies that she was planning to remove you from power, to declare your rule illegitimate and replace you with someone more controllable. You were 20 years old and you'd spent 4 years as her puppet, and you made a decision that you knew would damn you, but that felt necessary for survival. Your mother had to die, not for what she'd done politically, but for what she'd done to you in those bedchambers, for the years of violation that had left you twisted and broken, for the child that might or might not exist, for everything she'd taken from you that could never be returned. You planned it carefully, arranged what was supposed to look like an accident at sea, invited Agrippina to a festival at Baia, and offered her luxurious transport on a specially designed boat that would collapse and sink, hopefully drowning her in a way that appeared natural. She accepted the invitation, arrived at the festival, drank wine with you while you tried not to think about the fact that you were hours away from murdering your own mother, tried not to remember that this was the woman who'd given you life even if she'd also taken everything that made life worth living. The boat collapsed on schedule as she sailed back after the festival, the ceiling designed to fall and crush passengers. But Agrippina survived, swam to shore despite being 46 years old and injured, and when you received word that she'd lived, you felt terror unlike anything you'd experienced before because she would know. She always knew everything, and she would retaliate, and you sent soldiers immediately to finish what the boat had failed to accomplish. They found her at her villa, and she knew why they'd come, knew that her son had finally found the courage to kill her, and according to the historical accounts, her last words were, "Strike my womb. Strike the place that bore Nero," presenting her stomach to the swords, making explicit reference to her role as mother. And you've never been sure if she meant it as curse or as final gesture of maternal love or as acknowledgement of everything that had been wrong between you from the beginning. When they brought you confirmation that she was dead, you felt relief and horror in equal measure. Relief that you were finally free of her control, but horror at what you'd become, a matricide, someone who'd killed his own mother. And no amount of justification about self-defense or political necessity could erase the fication about self-defense or political necessity could erase the fundamental wrongness of what you'd done. The Senate voted to excuse the murder, declared Agrippina had been plotting against you and deserved death, but you knew and everyone knew that the real reason you killed her had nothing to do with political plots and everything to do with those nighttime visits, those violations, those years of being used by the woman who should have protected you. You ruled for another 14 years after Agrippina's death, years marked by increasing instability and cruelty. And historians would later argue about why you became so monstrous, whether it was inherent evil or the result of what had been done to you, whether the boy who'd been violated by his mother and forced to murder her could have turned into anything other than the tyrant you became. You married twice more after Octavia, treated both wives terribly, kicked one of them to death when she was pregnant because you learned from Agrippina that pregnancy could be used as a weapon, and perhaps you were trying to destroy any reminder of that child you might have fathered with your mother. You burned Rome and blamed Christians, executed thousands in elaborate public tortures, spent money so lavishly the treasury emptied, and everyone wondered what had broken you, what had transformed a promising young emperor into a monster. But nobody knew about those 4 years of nighttime visits. Nobody knew about the pregnancy. Nobody knew the specific ways your mother had destroyed you before you destroyed her. The historian Suetonius would later write about your relationship with Agrippina in his biography of the emperors, and his account includes details so disturbing that many later historians dismissed them as exaggeration or slander, claimed that no mother and son could possibly have engaged in the acts described, that such things were too unnatural to be believed. He wrote that you appeared in public in a litter with Agrippina and that the stains on your clothing afterward revealed what had occurred during the ride, that palace servants reported hearing sounds from your chambers that no mother and son should make together, that your sexual relationship was common knowledge among court insiders, even if it was never officially acknowledged. Modern historians debate whether Suetonius was telling truth or spreading rumors, whether the incest actually happened or was invented by enemies trying to further blacken your already terrible reputation. But the evidence suggests that something deeply wrong occurred between you and your mother, that the relationship was inappropriate, even by the flexible standards of Roman imperial behavior, that you were victimized by her in ways that left permanent psychological damage. What happened between you and Agrippina wasn't unique in history, even though we prefer to believe such things are rare aberrations, because absolute power combined with the absence of accountability creates conditions where the powerful can violate anyone, including their own children, where the normal boundaries that protect the vulnerable dissolve entirely. Where someone like Agrippina could rationalize that her son's body and sexuality belonged to her just as surely as his throne did because she'd created both. The dynamic between you was complicated by the fact that you were technically the person with power, the emperor who could order anyone's death, including hers, but the power imbalance ran the other direction because she'd shaped your entire psychology from birth, trained you to obey her, killed everyone who threatened her control over you, and by the time you technically had the power to refuse her, you'd been so thoroughly conditioned to submission that refusal felt impossible until you finally broke and swung to the opposite extreme from complete submission to murder. Your story raises uncomfortable questions about consent and power that are relevant far beyond ancient Rome. Questions about whether a child can ever truly consent to a parent regardless of technical legal age, whether authority and love can be so entangled that rejecting one means losing the other, whether victims of such abuse can ever fully recover or whether the damage is permanent, shaping everything that comes after into patterns of dysfunction and cruelty. You died at 30, suicide while fleeing from troops sent to execute you after the Senate finally declared you an enemy of Rome, and your last words were reportedly, "What an artist dies in me," focused on your lost musical career rather than the political and moral disasters of your reign. And perhaps that narcissistic self-pity was the final legacy of a childhood spent being used by a mother who taught you that other people existed only as tools for your satisfaction. Nero and Agrippina's stories survived through ancient historical accounts that were written by people with political agendas. People who wanted to show how corrupt and degenerate the imperial system had become. And it's impossible to know with absolute certainty how much of what Suetonius and Tacitus and other historians recorded was literal, truth versus politically motivated exaggeration. But what's undeniable is that something profoundly wrong occurred between this mother and son, that their relationship was inappropriate in ways that damaged both of them and through them damaged the entire empire they ruled. The incest, whether consummated or not, represented the ultimate expression of Agrippina's belief that she owned her son completely, that creating an emperor gave her the right to use him in every possible way, and Nero's eventual murder of his mother represented the only escape he could imagine from a relationship that had become unbearable. Neither of them emerged as sympathetic figures from this tragedy because both participated in creating the horror. Agrippina through her violations and Nero through his eventual transformation into a tyrant. But beneath the mutual monstrosity was a simpler story of a child abused by a parent and the lifelong consequences of that abuse. Rome remembered Nero as one of its worst emperors and Agrippina as one of its most manipulative and power-hungry women. But they didn't fully understand or didn't want to acknowledge that the two things were connected, that the emperor's cruelty grew directly from the mother's abuse, that you can't violate someone that fundamentally without creating damage that expresses itself in violence turned outward toward everyone else. The Senate damned Nero's memory, tore down his statues, struck his name from monuments, but they couldn't erase what had happened, couldn't undo the reality that absolute power had enabled absolute corruption of the most intimate relationship possible, and the empire would spend centuries trying to prevent another. Nero, while never quite understanding what had created the first one,